Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 18 of the Backyard Banter Podcast. My name is Matt Harmon. I'm the host of this show. I am the host every week. Also, I said I was going to stop making that joke, and I haven't been able to. So sorry about that for all the people who keep listening to the show. But before we get to our guest today, which is a tremendous guest, really excited to talk to him today. But before we do that, I got to get two little housekeeping notes out of the way. First, as I mentioned last time, we are running a contest for iTunes reviews. If you leave a review on iTunes, you'll be entered to win the Scott Fish Bowl. And if you don't know what the Scott Fish Bowl is, it's a 480 team Pro-Am fantasy football league, includes 320 writers, podcasters, analysts from a bunch of different sites: NFL.com, ESPN, Yahoo, RotoWorld, Football Guys, Pro Football Focus, and a bunch more. You get to play with some of the best. You can probably beat me and brag about it, and a bunch of other guys. You can also win a ton of prizes too. So if you leave a review on iTunes and it's good, you will get picked to be in the league, and I'll run that through the next episode, which brings me to my second point. Because the NFL draft is this week, we're only going to have one episode of the podcast. I'm not going to try to compete with the NFL. That would be foolish. But to make up for that, I brought on a really great guest for today's episode, and that is senior editor of RotoWorld, Evan Silva. Evan, how are you doing today?
Harmon, what's up, man? I'm doing real well.
Yeah, happy to have you here. This is pretty exciting. It's going to be a good chat today.
No doubt. I've listened to every single one of your podcasts so far. What are you up to, like 16, 18, something like that?
Yeah, this is 18, which is pretty shocking. Started doing 2 a week a little while ago just because people just kept demanding them.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I was curious about initially, because I knew that I would have interest in these podcasts because I'm, part of the fantasy industry, and I like to listen to Matthew Berry talk, and I love to listen to Cecil Lammey's stories, and Sigmund Bloom always makes you think, and Matt Waldman always makes you smarter, and you've mixed in some great other people who maybe don't have as big of names, and I think you've done a great job of like blending, and diversifying the podcast. And I was curious though, is it just me, people that are in the industry, or is it people that just play fantasy football, who really is interested in this podcast?
Well, that's a great question. The funny thing about it is I figured it would be mostly, like you mentioned, I figured guys in the industry would be interested. The target audience was obviously like aspiring writers, because that was really the goal, was to bring about interest from those people, kind of give them a guide so that they can hopefully, realize their life path or whatever. But it's been a lot more than that. Like people that have told me, I have no interest in being a fantasy football writer, or people that don't even play fantasy football or even really give a damn about football in general, because it's really, I just sit here, but the guests tell great stories, and I think it's been really relatable for people across different spectrums. So that's pretty sick.
Yeah, and you've already done 18 interviews, and I feel like you have the potential to, you could do hundreds. There's so much opportunity for this. It wasn't like this 5 years ago. There weren't a lot of fantasy writers. There really weren't. But Football Guys has gotten bigger. RotoWorld has gotten a little bit bigger. RotoViz came around, and a lot of different websites have popped up, and there are a lot more opportunities today than there were, 5 years ago, certainly 8 years ago.
Yeah, no doubt. Actually, to pull back the curtain here a little bit, I don't think I've mentioned this on the podcast, but about a week ago, I was realizing, like, God, there are so many good people to talk to. And like, I could even have guys, like you mentioned, Matthew Berry and Matt Waldman, I could have them do second episodes because they just offer so much perspective. But I went in and made like a spreadsheet of all these guests and like put them into different categories and stuff, because this is what I do with myself, because I'm a huge loser. But yeah, so and honestly, it was like overwhelming. I was like, wow, I'm only probably going to do this over the off season, and then who knows going forward, but there's so many people to talk to. And you're right, because there's so much opportunity. And it's a cool space. There's just like unique perspectives all around.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So To get into your perspective, Evan, I always start the podcast asking the guest, how did you first kind of come to, like your podcast co-host Ross Tucker calls it, how did you come to contract the sickness?
Yeah. I mean, I think I just always had it, and it wasn't just for football; it was for all sports. I don't know. When I was growing up, I would like write these books full of like notebooks and just fill them with, statistics and depth charts and predictions for the upcoming season. And I mean, I would always do that. And even when I was in college, this actually sounds dorky now that I think about it, real dorky. But even in college, when I would come home like for Christmas break, I would get right back into it, and I'd start writing about sports. And I mean, when I was done with college, when I was in college, I always read this website called Roto World, and I loved it because it was snarky and it was kind of funny, and it was, it dealt with projections and what Roto World thought would happen in the future, and they did a pretty good job, and they would provide like lineup information which you couldn't find anywhere else. And I was a fantasy baseball and fantasy football player at the time, and that's how I came to learn about Roto World. And I mean, I really think that I could have written about a lot of different sports, but it just so happened that when I contacted Greg Rosenthal, their opening was for a football writer, and I kind of carved out that opening, and just by begging Greg Rosenthal for an opportunity, and he gave me one. And so now football is definitely my sickness, and NBA DFS in the off season.
Oh God, good luck with that. I've mentioned this on the podcast several times. I have like zero interest in any other sport.
Okay.
Yeah, but no, I mean, and no shame to people that do, but yeah, it's I can't even imagine like so much of this is what I tell people when they ask me like, why don't you care about other sports? I'm like, well, so much of my brain is like already dedicated to football that like an unhealthy amount that like I already feel like if I started putting other sports in there, I would start to forget like my name, where I live, and that's all like, yeah. So I don't know, and I also care too much about other things like super off the wall politics and books and stuff like that. But I'm a weird guy anyways. But back to you, Evan. So you like reached out to Greg Rosenthal. What were you doing before that happened? Were you kind of like part-time in anywhere else, or what happened there?
Well, I had graduated from Marquette University, where your boy Alex Gelhar also went. And I had planned to go to law school, but I mean, I didn't fully apply myself in college, didn't get great grades. I just kind of went in there, got my degree, and got out. So I wasn't really looking at good law schools. I was just looking at some place to go to a law school, and I was taking the LSAT, and I was I took a class before the LSAT, et cetera. I was all in the process of doing that when I was talking with Greg Rosenthal, and I sent him a lot of the work that I would do over Christmas break and over summer break during college. And, he gave me a chance, and he gave me a chance to write blurbs. And he gave me a chance to write, simple little articles. And I mean, I did that for free for like 6 to 8 months. And then eventually Roto World hired me. This is before NBC had bought Roto World. Roto World hired me for, I think it was $500 a week. And, and I mean, at that point, like I was ready to spread my wings, man. I moved to Chicago, and I'll tell you what, living on $500 a week in Chicago is very, very difficult unless you have a lot of roommates.
Let me tell you, I'll jump in there real quick. I actually can kind of sympathize with that. I used to make at the job I had before I worked for NFL, I made like because I was working in social work and like was only part-time in football. I was making like $700 a month, or not a month, $700 like over a paycheck, and was living in like the DC area. So I can kind of sympathize with that.
Yeah, and some people would think that Chicago is expensive. Washington D.C. is maybe twice as expensive. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's one cool thing that I kind of picked up also from listening to these podcasts. I was born in Fairfax, Virginia. I know you're from.
Oh shit! Really?
Yeah.
That's where I lived right before I moved out here to LA.
Yeah, Adam Leviton is also from that exact same area, which is kind of interesting.
I didn't know that at all. I'm glad I don't live in Fairfax anymore, though. Personally, LA is a little bit better.
Yeah, are you liking it? Do you love it or what? Yeah,
it's I like it for the most. I like it a lot more than I expected to, because when I got the job out here, I was kind of like, yeah, I never really pictured myself in LA. Like, that's not really my scene, even though I put myself together with all the hair and all that, and I am a total like vain sociopath, but but nevertheless, like, it's not really the place I ever would have seen myself. But yeah, it's pretty cool out here. I don't know if I'll be here for, like, I don't know if I want to be here forever, but it's fun. There's a lot to do here, and so there's like something for everybody. And you think like LA has this real pretentious and like up its own the hind parts vibe about it, and it kind of like parts of it do, but there's also very laid back places, and like you can pretty much find whatever you're looking for, so it's not bad.
I listen to the Around the NFL podcast. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and that is because I cut out sports talk radio.
Yes. Smart move.
And I'm also always driving my daughter around to different, like, to ballet and soccer and school and all these different things. So I spend a decent amount of time in the car, but I the reason I said that is because I wanted to kind of like, if somebody heard this, how do you listen to so many podcasts, or how can I listen to that many podcasts? Just cut out sports talk radio and just listen to podcasts constantly. I feel like you'll feel like you're taking more away from what you're listening to. But I listened to the Around the NFL podcast because Chris Wessling and Greg Rosenthal are on there, and Chris will sometimes talk about how expensive LA is and how he isn't paid enough. And he talks about he talks about like how the women will only date you if you're 6'3" or taller.
Well, I am 6'3", so I don't have that problem that Wes does. But the other two parts I can definitely it is very expensive, and I'm probably not paid enough either, but I am also I just got here. So Chris has a couple right. He's got a few more years on me. He can start making those complaints on the podcast publicly, but
right. And initially you're just like, oh, this is awesome. I'm writing about football for a living. I'm living in LA, and it doesn't really hit you until like you need to buy something, right?
Right. Yeah, Wes is also, more than a few years older than me too. So like, as long as I can buy enough beer in a month and dog food for Charlie, like I'm all right for now. In a couple of years, maybe I'll get on the Fantasy Live podcast and start making those gripes. But that's a whole nother thing. But no, LA is great. I for the most part, it's pretty cool. I can't hate on it, but that's interesting. I totally didn't know that about you, that you lived in Fairfax. That's nuts.
Yeah, well, I lived in like Arlington. I was born in Fairfax, but I lived in Arlington until I was like 12, and then moved to St. Louis.
Nice. And the point you made about podcasts, I'll also like second that. I listen to pretty much like every football podcast that's out there, unless it's like too mainstream and terrible, and there are several of those. But because I obviously I do not have a daughter driving around to different places, but like when I walk my dog, listen to a podcast. Like during the season, I try not to when I go to the gym to listen to podcasts, because I prefer to listen to music. But like during the season, I do, because it's just, I don't know about you, Evan, but like I feel like I never have enough time to read content that's out there. But so like taking it in audio wise, like when I'm not doing anything else, like when I'm charting a receiver for reception perception, I'm usually listening to a podcast. Like that's just the best way to consume information.
That's a great point. Great point.
Yeah. So back to your story a little bit there, so really you pursued Greg, essentially, like you just kept hounding him. And I think that's kind of a point that's come around a lot. Like, Matt Franciscovich talked about it on his episode, one of my other coworkers, like that persistence is such a big deal. And kind of not being afraid. Were you ever at all worried that he was going to say no, or was that a factor in your mind, or was it just a blind pursuit?
Man, we're going back a while, I don't really remember exactly what my mind frame was. I just knew that I loved RotoWorld. I loved player news. I always enjoyed knowing about players. I remember when I was a little kid and my dad would take me to the Orioles game. This is before, the Nationals came around, of course. But my dad would take me to the Baltimore Orioles game, and every time a player would come up, he would explain to me, Randy Milligan, he's got some power, but he strikes out a lot, and that always interests me to like know things about players. So, I was never really super addicted to fantasy football. I just really like to know about players, and I think that meshed well with RotoWorld because RotoWorld has expanded to become bigger, more, but at its heart, still, RotoWorld is all about the player news, and we provide that content for free. We don't have lower level workers doing our news. It's Pat Doherty, it's me, it's Ray Summerlin, it's Nick Menzio. All of our writers write player news, and so I think that. Yeah, that's the nuts of RotoWorld, and that's something that I was pretty decent at right away, just because I had the ability to like take in a lot of information about players and regurgitate them in a readable way.
Yeah, and that of course is the heart of RotoWorld is the player news, and you mentioned earlier like the snark in it, and that's something that like some people have differing opinions on. I definitely like enjoying consuming a little news and like having kind of that last little quip in there. Why do you think that's like such an attractive quality of it?
Just because it makes it more interesting. It spices it up. It's sometimes the player news is boring. We have to do blurbs about offensive linemen at times, but if you can add some snark, and Pat Doherty is the best at this, and Ray is starting to get better. Ray's only been with us for like a year and a half, but he's starting to get more comfortable doing like snarky stuff. It takes a while to really get the hang of it, but RotoPat is the best at it, and number one, he's a really, really good writer. And number two, he's smart. And number three, he can write in a funny way. And he also knows a lot about, players and about the league. So he's the premier RotoWorld blurber right now.
Yeah, you can sometimes tell like which writer wrote that blurb or whatever just by kind of that last little bit of snark or sarcasm in there. And I think it's definitely funny. Yeah, you can tell which ones Pat does and which ones he doesn't. That back and forth that he got in, just sidebar, that back and forth that he got into with Pot Roast a couple of weeks ago or a week ago, that was that was too funny. I could.
Yeah, you got to have him on the podcast at some point. You got to have a million other people though. I don't need to add any to your plate.
Like I said, man, I got the spreadsheet, so it's all locked and loaded. We'll see what happens. Yeah, there's just so many people to talk to in the industry. And you mentioned that like how it's kind of different from how it was when you got in there. And I remember listening to like you and Sigmund on the couch a couple of times talking about like, and I know Sigmund says this all the time, that he's lucky that he got into it when he did and not now because there's so much more competition. So how have things changed since you first started in the industry?
Just the NFL exploded, number one. The NFL was not covered like this, 7 years ago. The NFL was, each team would have one beat writer. There were times where the beat writers would have to take off for certain teams and cover other sports. So no one would really even technically be covering the team for a few months in the off season, it's just totally different. Twitter wasn't around, Twitter has exploded, has played a role in the exploding the fantasy industry, because now, I know who 14 team mocker is, or I know who, I mean, I may not have known who you were at one point,
Yeah.
I know who, I mean, I think it helped me to find out like who JJ was. I don't think that I knew who JJ was before Twitter came around. So, it put me in contact with Rich Rebar. I don't know if we didn't have Twitter and Rich Rebar had been writing for XN Sports for 7 years, I'm not totally sure that I would have ever even known who he was, and that's just an example, but Twitter has played a huge role in allowing fantasy writers to connect.
Yeah, it certainly has. And I mean, I owe pretty much all my success to, or at least being the impetus to it, is Twitter. That's how, whenever somebody asks me like, well, what do I do like to get out there? I'm like, well, all right, get out there, man. Like, start tweeting people back and forth. And like, I don't know. I don't know about you, Evan, but like, I definitely pay attention to, I mean, you have a lot more followers than I do, and I'm sure your mentions are probably more of a disaster than mine are at times. But I definitely like try to pay attention to everything that's going on. And I will say, like, you're of the bigger names in fantasy football, you're one of the guys that definitely like shares other people's work more. Like you mentioned, you've tweeted out my podcast a couple times, and thank you for that, for sure. And like a lot of other like smaller writers' work. Like, why is that? And I think that's pretty cool. I mean, it helps grow the community. And so yeah, I don't know. I think, why do you think that's an important thing to do?
I mean, I don't know. I think that I used to feel like a sense of competition against other fantasy writers. I mean, this is very early, maybe my first year or two doing fantasy football. But then I went to a fantasy, like an FSTA conference. And I'm guessing you've never been to one, probably, Harmon.
No. Nope.
I know that Sig went to this one in Dallas after the season. I was unable to go, and I regret that because I wish I would have been able to meet him. But
it's a trip, let me tell you that.
I think that the first time that I went to one of these fantasy conferences, I just kind of understood that I came to realize that like these are my people, I mean, not like Moses, my people, but like I'm like these people, and because I could talk to these people about football for hours and hours and hours on end, and they kind of thought like me, they were just like, this is like kind of who I'm a part of. I spend a huge chunk of my life devoted to knowing all about, knowing almost every player on every single roster. I mean, these are not like competitors against me. These are people that are very much like me. And so I want these people to prosper. I want our industry to prosper. And I mean, I don't always think about that every time that I, try to distribute somebody else's work, or pass it out, to other people so other people can read it. But I mean, it just kind of comes naturally to me that I want to, number one, show my Twitter or give good information to my Twitter followers, but also, to just be able to just spread good work. Matt Harmon, you do awesome work. Waldman does incredible work. There are smaller fantasy writers that do incredible work, and they don't always get, a platform. And it's really the least that I can do, because I want to see other people prosper. And this industry is just, it's a great industry to be in. And I don't take that for granted. And I want to see other people do well, especially if they're good. Like if I see that somebody's good, they deserve to do well. And the least that I can do is tweet out an article that they wrote or a podcast that they were on, or, what have you.
Yeah. And it's to come to speak from the perspective of somebody that, not long ago was in that aspiring group or did not have the job that I do now, like the couple times when you like tweeted out like, yeah, people should follow Matt Harmon or like you like listen to this Faked Goods podcast appearance Harmon did, like it was awesome. That's fueling for the audience too, like for the person you're tweeting about. Like it's motivation, and it's like, oh man, like, you know, if Evan Silva or who have you is tweeting out my work, I better make sure it continues to be good. And that's important. But you know, the funny thing is, like, a lot of people in our position don't feel that way or aren't like that. That they do view everything as like a competition. And I know we've talked about that like with other people on the podcast, and it's something that definitely bothers me. And that's why I do this show, is so that other people can find their success and find that path. And because it is a great industry to be a part of, that I'm lucky I'm here. I think we're all lucky we're here. And yeah, it's a cool thing, I think, that you do that.
One other way that the industry has changed too is that, well, just the kind of the way that people in the sports media or, you know, the fantasy industry kind of, so about like 6 to 8 years ago, the way that people thought you come up or that you kind of make a name for yourself is through ripping the bigger entities, through ripping, you know, ESPN, you know, like with Deadspin. I remember, you know, a long time ago, a lot of people used to try to rip Matthew Berry a lot. You know, it's not really like that anymore. You know, but that used to be a popular way to kind of get your name out there. I mean, to some extent, that's how Pro Football Talk.com got big, is because they would, you know, I mean, they would kind of rip ESPN sometimes. You know, they would rip whatever, you know, personalities on ESPN, and they to some extent made their name that way, but it's really not like that anymore, I don't think. I mean, do you really see anybody growing their name or their brand or themselves through ripping people?
I mean, I think some people still try to do it. I definitely think,
I think some people still try to do it.
Yeah. I definitely see people doing it, but I don't see those people like going anywhere. You know, I've never seen somebody that I viewed as one of those people like that rips on others or tears down other people's analysis, that ends up getting anywhere. I mean, I feel like you can build a little following, but you're going to put a ceiling on yourself when you do that, in my opinion. It bugs me a lot, like when I see people do that, and I tend to like, you know, and I don't want to sound like I'm, you know, better than anybody, because I'm not. But it definitely makes me kind of like just lose interest in what that person has to say. And I mean, there's a lot of trash analysis out there, but I just don't see the point in like trying to step on somebody else to lift yourself up. I don't know. That's just me.
Yeah, but I think that at some point there was a point at which people kind of wanted that. You know, people wanted to read on Deadspin, you know, what mistakes had ESPN personalities made lately, or, you know, et cetera. But I don't know, just a thought.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I definitely can't speak to that perspective. I know that I obviously came in kind of later than that. Right. So yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't know that at all. Evan, are there any other main changes you think that have happened, you know, either good or bad, or is that pretty much the main stuff?
I think that's mostly the main stuff.
Nice. So kind of continuing onward through your journey, I guess. So was it just that Greg moved on to other opportunities that ended up, you know, you getting yourself up the ladder, I guess, to now you're kind of like the top dog there?
So for a few years, Greg Rosenthal wasn't really writing for Roto World anymore. He was writing for ProFootballTalk.com. I mean, he was, you know, still my boss and Chris Wessling and Adam Leviton's boss, but he was writing for ProFootballTalk.com. So we didn't really talk as much, and it was me, Leviton, and Chris, and Rotopat came along at some point in there. But yeah, when Greg left to go to NFL.com, he took Chris Wessling, and it was me and Adam Leviton and Rotopat, and we had to get some more bodies. So we got Nick Menzio. 2 years ago, we got Ray Summerlin. We added this dude named Jesse Pantuosco, and he's coming along as a blurber for sure. But yeah, I mean, when Greg went to NFL.com, that kind of solidified me and Adam Leviton as the top football writers for Roto World.
Nice. Well, yeah, it's all about kind of taking advantage of those opportunities when they show up, or even just being there. I feel like that's something that a lot of the guests have kind of reiterated that theme. Like, I didn't really do anything too much. I was just kind of there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was just there hanging out,
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's part of what this all is. Like, sometimes it comes off so serious as if it's this or that or the other, but it's really just sitting around talking about football,
Yeah, I think I wasn't just there. Like, I was like working my ass off every single day, And me and Wessling were, and we were producing great content. I think, but yeah, I mean, it was Greg wanted to move on. He had a great opportunity out there in LA, and he has built up a great. I mean, he can build things. He pretty much built Roto World, and now
brick by brick. That's what they say on the podcast.
I know, and that's exaggerated, but but he's a builder for sure. I mean, he helped ProFootballTalk.com as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's pretty impressive. Like, I remember like the Around the League blog back in the day, and it was like there was nothing going on there really until Rosenthal kind of showed up, and then they have this huge podcast. Those guys are on the network now. I mean, that's pretty nuts. I'm sure, especially like for you, you've known these guys, like worked with them forever. Like that's got to be a pretty crazy feeling, I would imagine.
Yeah, when I remember talking to Greg specifically about that, I was like, "Oh man, are you going to be like on NFL Network?" And he was like, "No." But he made it there, man. I mean, he's on TV, and it's pretty cool.
Yeah, watching him go back and forth with Mike Silva about like his quarterback rankings or whatever this year was pretty fun. I don't remember what they talked. Like, they had some nickname for it. Like, I don't remember, like, but it was good stuff. And that's the fun part, though. Like, there are so many opportunities that people can take advantage of now. There's just so many places to contribute. When you look like throughout the industry, who are some kind of people that are like, what kind of content kind of piques your interest, I guess is my question there, which was asked very poorly.
That's a good question. I don't even know how to describe it. I mean, anytime that I see somebody like Greg Cosell or Waldman or Sig or Rich Rebar or JJ or Mike Clay or you or I mean, I don't know, I don't want to like leave out anybody, but anytime I see somebody that I really respect their opinion, I want to hear it. I want to hear it. I also think that RotoViz has done a great job of, they question everything.
Right.
They attack things, through a data-driven mindset. So I think what they do really interests me. I don't know, man. I mean, sometimes it just comes down to like having a little bit of free time and, seeing something retweeted or tweeted on my timeline and, saving it for later and going back and reading it, Mm-hmm. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I don't know how to describe it, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm gonna ask you this because this is something that I mean, I don't think we've ever discussed this on the podcast. Probably because I've been too afraid it's too antagonistic, but I'm gonna ask you anyways about where do you stand on like the, you know, kind of this division that seems to happen between like metrics versus film analysis? Because you're kind of somebody that I feel like is in the middle, not to mention you're obviously one of the bigger names out there and like you kind of pay attention to everything, but where do you stand on all that? Like just dish feelings on that. I'm all about feelings.
So like I've read like Nate Silver, you know, I've read stuff that Paul DiPodesta has written, and those guys are considered, you know, data analysts and numbers driven decision makers. However, if you dig a little deep into, you know, Nate Silver and Paul DiPodesta, what they really believe, they both firmly believe that watching players and paying attention to players and scouting players is absolutely critical to being able to make good predictions and make good decisions based on the information available. I mean, I've heard Paul DiPodesta describe analytics in a totally non-numbers driven way. You know, he's, you know, this is not the exact analogy that he used, but it's similar. Like if you drive in a zone a couple of times and you're going, you know, 40 and a 30 in that zone and you get pulled over, or if you see a couple of people pulled over in that same zone, you know, you kind of know like, ooh, the cops might be looking at this zone. So I'm going to adhere strictly to the speed limit in this zone. And all you're doing is taking data that you have collected in the past and trying to make a better decision with that data, you know? So it's not all, analytics is not all number stuff, you know. Mm-hmm. It's trying to use information to make better decisions, and that's all that it is. So I don't think that you can really approach it from one. I mean, there are special people that can approach it from one way or the other, I think, and have success doing that. But I think that unless you have a special gift like Matt Waldman, you know, I think that you need to look at all the available data, and that's pretty much what Nate Silver writes in his book. You know, is that you want to try to consider as many different variables as you can, and you want to try to arrive at the best decision that you can.
Right. For me personally, I think like the kind of, you know, we mentioned this earlier, like people trashing each other on either side of the fence seems kind of stupid to me. And I definitely think that there's a lot to learn from both. Like somebody was asking me today, like about John Moore's Phenom Index and like how he has Josh Doxson so low and like what I kind of thought about that. And I guess my point to the guy was like, I don't really get too bent out of shape about this sort of stuff. Like somebody reaches a different conclusion with a differing method. Like that's what's going to happen. And I don't know, to me, that's okay. And that's how I think we get better as a whole unit.
Yeah. And I think that what people are trying to do when they analyze things through a strictly numbers driven way is they're trying to assess the probabilities of certain players. So Josh Doxson, you know, maybe according to John Moore's model, and I love John Moore, by the way. We've had him right on Roto World. He was right there with you on Allen Robinson. He might have been before you, Harmon. On Allen
was.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, he was. But they're trying to assign probabilities. So in John Moore's model, you know, it's possible that Josh Doxson only has a 47% chance of becoming a wide receiver one eventually, when, you know, somebody who's really a believer in him from a film standpoint might say that he's, 63%. And then we're just trying to, use the information that we have to, try to make our dynasty rookie picks. And I mean, yeah, I don't think that film people and numbers people should be fighting. I think that they should be trying to work together to make the best decisions and make the best possible predictions.
Yeah, for sure. And it's like you said, it kind of paints like a range of outcomes when you do things from a strictly numbers based approach. And I like that because then yeah, I mean, then like what you're getting yourself into, I guess. And yeah, I mean, from a reception perception standpoint, Josh Doxson's fantastic, but that doesn't mean that I need to think that he's like a 100% guarantee for success,
Right.
because that's insane. Nothing is guaranteed, Yeah. Yeah, it's all just using the information that's available. And there's a ton of information out there. There's a ton of good people creating content. Evan, if somebody approached you kind of like you approached, and I'm sure people have, like you approached Greg Rosenthal back in the day, like, kind of wanted to get in with Roto World. And I know it's a little bit different now than it was then, but like if they were an aspiring writer looking for your kind of advice, what would be one of the few things you would tell them is necessary for them to do?
Just work hard and produce good content. And I think that you're going to be in good shape. You don't necessarily need to hassle somebody like I did to Greg Rosenthal, but I mean, just be willing to work hard. That's what helped me, was a willingness to work hard, a willingness to work without getting paid, a willingness to work where I couldn't, I couldn't pay my rent some months, when I was living in Chicago, making $500 a week. But yeah, I mean, just have a good work ethic, and I think that you'll be in good shape.
Yeah, that really is the key. And I don't really know personally where I found good work ethic, because it definitely wasn't there throughout school until like the last 2 years of my college experience. But I don't know. It just kind of comes to you, I think, especially if you, like you mentioned, if you have the sickness for football, like sometimes you'll get into it and you'll find the work very naturally, but other times you might not. And we've talked about that on the podcast too. Like this definitely is not for everybody. There's a lot of people that are just meant to be fans of the game and everything. And I think that's an important thing to find out as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't know. Sometimes I don't feel comfortable like trying to like give people advice,
Yeah. Right.
You know what I'm saying? Like,
no, I hear you. And that's kind of why I guess I did like why I do the podcast, is because, people will email me and ask me for advice, and I don't know. And so many people ask me to tell my story on the podcast. And like, eventually I probably will find a way to do that. Especially like I would like to talk about some of the, like the personal life aspects that led me to this point. Cause I think it's important for other people to hear, but I don't want people to listen to what I did because I don't know what the hell I did. You know what I mean? Like, this all happened pretty quickly for me too. And that's another thing that I don't want people to take away from like my story, that, and again, I'm not saying this because like I'm better than anybody else. That's just the way life happens, and like I woke up one day and was like, hey, I'm going to be a football writer. And then like 2 years later, here we are. But that doesn't happen for everybody. And like, I guess that's another point too, is that, there's just different paths for people to take.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Evan, kind of winding down here, I got a couple interesting questions to ask you here, just about like, like you mentioned you have a daughter, and if you feel kind of comfortable talking about that, like what's your life outside of being a football writer like, and how does this job kind of change that?
Well, my daughter is always changing because she's growing, so she, like every day she adds the capability to do something new. And I mean, that's not even exaggerating. She like is becoming more and more of a person every single day. And like, I can see it. So that makes the responsibilities that are associated with her, they increase every day, really. So it's something that in future, during the NFL season, when things are super, super busy, it's something that I'm going to have to, make sacrifices with my work, and I mean, I've already cut out a lot of things, associated with work during the NFL season. I mean, the number one thing that I really do is write this matchups column on Roto World, which you can read for DFS or season long, and it pretty much breaks down every single game every week.
It's huge. It's a very impressive piece of content.
Oh, thanks, man. Well, yeah, I mean, I try to do my best.
So, Evan, obviously we talked a lot about how the industry's changed, and one of the biggest reasons that it's changed is the influence of DFS. And I know you've definitely taken it and run with it in a lot of ways, like you mentioned with the matchups column, and you definitely mentioned it obviously on the Fantasy Feast. And how has that kind of changed your approach, and where do you see? I mean, again, where do you see the DFS thing going?
I mean, I'm just trying to stay optimistic about it because it's really good for our industry as a whole. People are more likely to read your wide receiver article every week because they want to learn about wide receivers, and you break down matchups too on NFL.com.
Yep.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. Cause I read a few of those during the season. People are more likely to read our stuff, it's really that simple. I mean, Roto World wants to expand our DFS coverage every year. For me personally, it has really helped the popularity of my column. It has given me opportunities to work with the Fantasy Insider Show on Fridays. We do a show called the Swolecast with Davis Maddock, and
I've seen a couple of those.
Okay, cool.
That's a great name, by the way.
Yeah, it's awesome. But yeah, I mean, it's just given me so many more opportunities, and I mean, people like it.
Yeah.
It's a lot of fun, and I hope that it's around to stay.
Yeah. Let me ask you this, and because this is a question that I go back and forth with myself on, partly because of my own societal beliefs, I guess you could say, and the conflicts I have with that. Do you think it's fun more so because of the money or because of the way the game is structured?
It's fun for me even when I don't have a big week.
Yeah.
So that tells me that I like it for more than just the money. I mean, there's nothing better than getting a big score and winning some money. But
yeah, you yourself had a pretty big one this year, right?
And it's a challenge every single week, It's a challenge every single week, and I don't know, man. It's a lot of fun, and it's great for the fantasy industry, and I hope that it survives, and I'm optimistic that it will.
Yeah, for sure.
The only thing that I'm kind of scared about is, is it regulated to a point so much in certain states that it becomes not even worth playing? That's a worry that I have. I mean, I think it'll last. I think it will last in most states, but will it be worth playing?
Yeah, that is a good question. Working for the league, I definitely kind of got some hints of the negative parts of it. Or negative feelings towards it a little earlier than I think others did. So all the backlash didn't really surprise me when it started happening. Mm-hmm. As far as, and just to kind of answer my own question there, I think that you're right though. It's definitely more fun. It's fun for more reason than just the money, in my opinion. And I think the money is obviously the biggest hang up of it. And I don't really know. That's not my lane as to how to fix that at all. But it's fun. It's because of, like you mentioned, the weekly challenge of it all, and trying to fit things in. It's it's a different puzzle for my brain to solve, I guess. And that's what interests me about it for sure. Evan, kind of winding down here, for one, I really want to thank you for your time tonight. This has been a lot of fun talking to you, and I think just all the just the changing paths of our industry. I think you did a good job talking about those. I always give the guest one last opportunity to have the floor before I yank it out from under you before we get out of here. So any other things you want to get off your chest before we get out of here? Now the floor is yours. As my dog is wagging his collar in the background.
I would just say, no matter what you do, if you're trying to get into the fantasy industry, if you're working at a bank, whatever, just try to work hard and show other people that you're willing to work hard. And I think that that's one of the keys, if not the key, to advancement in any sort of business.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And there's a lot of, and when you work hard, people will see it and people will find you. That's for sure. So again, Evan, thank you for your time tonight. Everybody is probably already following you on Twitter or reading Roto World. But if you're not, get with it. And so as for all you guys listening out there, remember you can get entered to win a spot in the Scott Fish Bowl. If you leave a review and rating on iTunes, and remember, try to be creative, try to be funny. I saw one guy comment and say, "The show's really good, but I'm just leaving this to get in the Scott Fish Bowl." I can tell you that guy, that cat's probably not going to be the one that gets picked. Remember, here's a life lesson, people: know your audience, and so I think you can figure out what makes me laugh or I enjoy if you've been listening to the show so far. So try to think of it that way. So remember, you can get entered. Please leave a rating, a review, and I will pick the winner on the next podcast, which we'll record next Monday. So definitely check that out. And again, want to thank you all so much for listening, and I hope you learned something today.